Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the newest album from Jhené Aiko called Trip. I'll admit, I'm a little bit at a loss here. I wasn't expecting it. There was no real warning. The singles were scattered with no real promotional rollout. The album just kind of came out of nowhere last Friday, leaving a mostly bewildered audience to respond to its meandering 85-minute length and array of unexpected guest stars. But you know what? It was more than that. Even despite more artists choosing to embrace these surprise albums for the immediate spark and social media impact, I've seen more fail than succeed. And as much as I am a fan of Jhené Aiko, I was concerned that she just didn't have enough clout at this point, even with the project as large as this, to truly grab the conversation. Now look, in a just world, she would have that clout. I have repeatedly gone on the record saying that her 2014 debut album, Sold Out, was criminally overlooked and underrated. And while I've never really been a fan of her work with Big Sean in 2088, there is something that's just wrong that her biggest hit on the Hot 100 to date is a collaboration with Omarion, DJ Mustard, and Chris Brown, where she talks about a guy eating her booty like groceries. But again, Sold Out was not exactly an easy record to process. It was very low-key, it was subtle, the instrumentation was a lot warmer and organic than the R&B that was popular in 2014. Hell, she released it 2 years later in 2016, I can imagine she would have gotten a lot more critical acclaim and attention. And I've always liked her writing and her eye for detail, and her exploration of themes that always had a lot more complexity than a lot of folks gave her credit. So yeah, while I was a little bit reticent about a record that was 85 minutes long and primarily focused on an extended drug trip, Jhené Aiko has earned the benefit of the doubt with me, so okay, what'd I find on Trip? Well, here's the thing. My biggest commentary surrounding Jhené Aiko's debut was that it was underrated, but I think the more apt term is misunderstood, which can certainly happen when you make a very low-key release that can seem deceptively lightweight if you aren't willing to dig into the larger details and the bigger picture. And Trip is very much the sequel to that. Not only that the album's framing device of an extended drug trip is masking a lot more emotional complexity than many people will give it credit, but it also has a narrative arc that means it's not nearly as listless as so many have claimed. Now, does that mean that some of the grievances about this record aren't valid? Of course not. It certainly does run long, and there are definitely some artistic choices that deserved a little bit more refinement or consideration. And yeah, I would not say this is better than Sold Out. But when it comes to this brand of meditative and surprisingly complex and layered R&B, Jhené Aiko is criminally underrated. I will say it again. And Trip is a double dose of evidence because, again, I think this album's pretty great. And I'm going to start off with Jhené Aiko herself, because arguably she's doing more of the heavy lifting this time around vocally than even on previous albums. I've already said that in the past that I am a fan of her naturally expressive voice. They can kind of play coy as a defense mechanism while still showing remarkable subtlety, a factor that makes up in spades for her limited range. But this record is asking her to do a fair bit more, even along that with phenomenal multi-tracking. We'll be getting to that thematic arc in a bit to really dissect it in detail, but to take her from the slight daze of intoxication to sifting through the reasons that she's feeling so love-struck and vulnerable, even hesitant about that vulnerability, to outright defensive and hostile, to moments of genuine terror on songs like Overstimulated and Bad Trip that sound almost a little bit too real, that she's proving through a layered performance that the drug trip and even the love story that she's living have roots in something that's much deeper. And you know, it's a damn shame that her guest stars just are not on the same page in terms of delivery. Now, I'll give points to Corrupt for showing up as the hard-edged but genuinely concerned older friend figure, and the interplay with Brandy on Ascension was flat out excellent. They really sounded great opposite each other. And hell, even the half-stoned Dr. Chill, he kinda have his place, even if he does feel a little bit lacking in dimension when it comes to the lyrics. But despite the fact that Big Sean is her real-life boyfriend and is clearly trying, it's the same issue as with 2088. He's just not really on her level. And while Sway Lee isn't terrible on Sativa, you have to wonder if they only got him because they couldn't get The Weeknd for the same role, who'd probably add a fair bit more nuance and lyrical complexity all around. But again, the majority of the story here is not about these side characters. It's more about Jhené Aiko's personal journey, so let's really dig into that content and the themes. Now, again, like with Sold Out, this is not a record that's aiming to be overly complex in the lyrical details and writing style, which makes the details of the overall arc all the more important. I mean, right from the very first track, it's apparent that Jhené Aiko is taking drugs for more than just reckless hedonism or even an escape. For her, it's more meditative and trying to form a connection with something. And yet, when that unnamed guy quickly enters her story, it's clear that him saving her on the end of Jukai is a willful deflection on her part from really getting to the core of the issue. But for as head over heels as Jhené might seem on the next few songs, the imagery on tracks like Moments and Only Lovers Left Alive seem oddly panicked, a little bit desperate, even apocryphal in the last case. She also seems keenly aware of this guy's flaws, which seems to inspire him to further blur her consciousness of that whole thing with even more drugs. And note that her male co-star is no longer her actual boyfriend Big Sean, but now more of a stranger with Sway Lee. And yet you can tell that she's still straining, she wants to trust him, provide a little bit less of an overtly sexual connection, more of just a sense of closeness and emotional intimacy. And yet you can tell with each song that she's trying to find that balance, it constantly shifts, she just believes it less and less. Now this takes us to Never Call Me, which does fit the distrustful arc, but also features the most references to her real-life divorce from producer Dot the Genius, which I will say does kind of hurt the verisimilitude of the album's story a little bit, but it's here where we head into the most harrowing and compelling part of this album, starting with Nobody, where Jhené just sees the lingering pains which she's been trying to paper over surge up to the surface, none of which gets any better when the guy just tries to help by just giving her even more drugs. And what makes it abundantly clear is that the drugs are only a layer to the story, because these songs are not psychedelic or delirious, instead racked with mournful layers of grief surrounding the passing of her brother from cancer in 2012, as she's never properly processed, and now all that grief and pain is coming with her heightened senses to the surface, and then all the themes snap into place. Because again, this was never about the drugs, or even really about those other guys in the situation, but dealing with that deeper grief and loss. And thus it kind of makes sense that when she first starts her trip, she's immediately waylaid, almost intentionally, or that the guy who she desires that emotional closeness with reminds her of her brother, or that said guy who can't effectively fill that hole for her, only seeks to numb her further because that's all he really can do. But once that guy is out of the picture, and after Dr. Chill tries to ply her with more drugs, a detour that I would argue isn't really quite necessary, she resumes her attempt to form any sort of broader connection with that brother across time and space, or at least come to some sort of peace. And while there is some feeling of deeper fulfillment, her daughter tugging her back to earth with Sing to Me, and both Frequency and Ascension seeming to imply some moment of balance and peace that she knows that this guy is now in a better place. We then get the title track with the statements that the men in her life, they can't save her. They can't even save the world around her. She can only do that and come to that unique peace for herself. And while that guy might hype along for some of the ride, his love and his presence brings out the emotions that are both good and bad. The sort of oddly weary come down track that feels like a credits moment more than directly connected to the album itself, which of course is exactly how the short film Jhené Aiko released with the album ends. It ends with this song over the credits. But even beyond that, without the film itself actually reinforces this dramatic arc, the themes also do feel a little bit scattered on the album alone, which, yeah, has a similar issue to Sold Out, but perhaps a little bit more tightness in the writing overall could have pulled things together a little bit better. Now, granted, that's pretty much the same statement you can make about most of this project when it comes to the instrumentation and production. Because if we're looking for the area that's attracted the most valid criticism, it would come in the composition and overall arc of the album. Not the production, let me stress this. The blissed out warm haze that colors Jhené Aiko's records are often by far my most favorite part. And the full organic presence of these tones does wonders in terms of complementing her voice and her flow. And while I'm always a sucker for great guitar accented R&B, in this case supplied across the record by John Mayer of all people, helped by producers that let just enough feedback and texture in. It's the added instrumentation around that really ends this album so much character, from the textured percussion to watery touches of synth to the welcome horn section in the strings, the thrumming cellos beneath Jukai, the sharper hip house vibe of Only Lovers Left Alive that actually worked quite well for me, kind of reminded me of a K-Tronada song, the bubbly tap of the bass opposite the piano and the deep kick drum on When We Love with the gorgeous saxophone accents, the breathy ocarina tones against the faded cloud of melody on Bad Trip that leads to the clipped spikes of melody puncturing the mist on Oblivion, the gentle organ and the strings that swells, that pushes out through an Ascension, and of course the thick thrums of bass against the live drums, the harp and the cello on Overstimulated. That might be the most powerful song on this entire album. Man, I love that chorus melody. Hell, even on some of the more trap-leaning or hip-hop leaning songs on this album with the beats on While We Were Young and You Are Here, they've got an organic depth and melodic foundation that I really like. Now, it's not always perfect. That weedy little pickup and cushion on the murmurs that anchors Never Call Me, it's not great. And I ran out of patience for the oily knock and pitch shifting of Psilocybin incredibly quickly. Did not like that song. But again, the larger issue is compositional. This is a record that runs 22 tracks in 85 minutes. And for as much as the dramatic arc does a solid job sustaining that length better than I expected, there are definitely songs that run longer than they should and interludes that do kind of feel redundant, especially opposite songs that coast more on the actual vibe than a strong defined hook and identity of their own. This album definitely works more as a whole than in pieces. But you know what, as a whole, look, the guest stars don't always deliver. It's definitely flabbier than Sold Out and doesn't quite hit with the same depth or punch, but there is an emotive complexity and gorgeous production style that really works for me, as well as it did on Jhené Aiko's debut, and thus I really like this album. There's a fair bit more going on than a lot of people, including critics, will give credit, and when you factor in a lot of beautiful melodies and a really impressive lead performance, Jhené Aiko owns this record. I think it's enough for me to give this an 8 out of 10. Yeah, I'm definitely recommending this. Again, it's a lot to ask when you have a record this long, this mood-centric, and really this subtle. There's a lot of really great details in the performance that I didn't even touch on here, but hey, if you're a fan of this style of R&B, or if you really like that SZA album Control from earlier this year, trust me when I say, if you give this album time, definitely worth it. Check it out, you won't regret it. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. Like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I am so happy I got a chance to cover this record. There's just so much little detail that I really appreciate. It is a beautiful album, front to back. Beyond that, if you guys want to actually buy the record, links in the description below. And if you guys want to I want to hear your opinions on this, especially again with comparison with Jhené Aiko's other work. I got the poll up there, happy to hear it. Beyond that, if you guys want to support this channel or get a little bit more involved in my scheduling process, link to my Patreon is right over there, where 3 times a week you guys get to vote on my schedule, and once a week for the higher tier contributors you get to add albums, movies, or even a top 10 list to that schedule. More details right there. I'm so grateful for all of your support. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.